Okay, so now we're going to explore the lattice deformer a little bit and see if we feel like we can get any useful functionality out of the lattice deformer. So what we need to do is select the mesh only, and then you go to Create Deformers, Lattice. Now, one of the tricky things about a lattice deformer is that you can't, with the lattice, right here where it says, in your channel box where it says Outputs, and you have this Local Influences, I think that one was it. We'll have to experiment and see, but one of these sets cannot be altered after you tweak your lattice. So if you move it, then you can no longer edit that. So I'm going to set T divisions to, 5 is good. And what I want to do is just experiment with it. So what all the lattice is you don't really interact, well, you can interact with the lattice as a whole and squash your ball down, but you see how awkward that looks compared to the squash deformer? Not preserving volume at all. So what I think is fun to do sometimes is, if you right click on the lattice, it has components, and you called lattice points, and you can grab these lattice points, and if you wanted to make a flat spot on the ball, a perfectly flat spot, and you could drag some of these points down, and then the bottom is perfectly flat that way. Okay, that would be a pretty handy tool when it's like hitting a wall or something. Okay, now this can be controlled and to affect any portion of the ball by going to a couple different settings. So if we hit Control A and select the FFD1, and right in this attribute where it says outside lattice, right now it's set to inside. That means it's going to affect only stuff that's inside of the original lattice before you deformed it. The setting that we really want is to say all. So it doesn't matter where it's at in the Maya scene, it's going to deform it. That way, if the ball mesh ends up outside the lattice deformer, it's still going to work. Okay, so now there's something that I did wrong that you guys may not have noticed, but I created my lattice deformer while my ball was already deformed by my squash and bend deformers. So my lattice deformer is kind of a weird shape compared to my ball. So what I really would like to do is just undo that before I created the lattice deformer. Go back to the ball being selected into my channel box and reset the curve on my bend and the factor on my squash so it's back to 0. And then I'll go back and recreate that lattice. Now I've got a lattice that's nice and cubical. And I can do those same deformations. Now there are 2 nodes created in a lattice. You have the FFD1 lattice and the lattice base. I like to go ahead and rename these because those are terrible names. So if you want to rename in your hypergraph, all you have to do is hold down Control, then double click a node, and you can rename that node. And I like to call them the main deforming lattice, the ball lattice in this case, just underscore lattice. And then this other one, I like just do the I do the same, but it ends with base. So ball underscore lattice base. Okay, so I want to show you guys something. If I move this ball lattice around, it moves the ball wherever the lattice goes. If I scale it, it's going to scale the ball. If I move the lattice base and the lattice at the same time, it's not going to do anything at all. The reason for that is because the lattice is referencing the space of the lattice base. So if I move the base only, the ball will move in the opposite. It's going to do something really weird, basically. You can see before it leaves that space, that the ball tries to move in the opposite direction. Okay, all deformers work this way, but not all of them show you that that's how they're working. So the lattice is a really good, pretty simple example of how all deformers work. Okay, so now in order to control this, what we need to do is add both of these nodes to our ball group. That way when we move the ball group around, the lattice base and the lattice all move with the mesh. And so we can move it anywhere we want to, and it's not going to do anything to it. It's just like you can move it around in the scene, and that's the desired effect. Now we also need to check our input history, our history for the mesh, to see if it's in the right order. So let's try using all of our deformers. So we'll go ahead and add some curvature in, some factor for our squash, and now let's see what happens when we manipulate our lattice. Okay, well that's not what we wanted, right? So, yeah, I need to go and set that attribute that I told you guys about. So if I hit Control A to open up my attribute editor, and then go to the FFD1, and that says the outside lattice attribute, we need to set that to all. And that's going to affect everything in all space. Okay, and now I want the class to decide where is the most appropriate place for this to be in history, and we're going to do that for the rest of class period. We're going to experiment with this and see what, or maybe not the rest of the class period, but a good portion of the next part of the class period. We'll figure out how, if we should use this lattice, and if we should, where it should be in history on our ball mesh.